The golden light of Friday evening candles flickered across the faces of Temple Beth Shalom's congregation as they gathered in unprecedented joy. After 23 years of crushing financial struggle, their mortgage had been mysteriously paid in full just 3 days ago. Rabbi Samuel Goldstein stood at the bema watching 200 souls who had sacrificed everything to keep their spiritual home alive, now embrace with tears of pure relief streaming down their weathered faces. Mrs. Sarah Rosen, 84 years old, clutched her 8-year-old granddaughter Emma's hand so tightly the child winced. Just 6 months earlier, Sarah had walked into the rabbi's office with her late husband's gold wedding band wrapped in tissue paper, her arthritis-gnarled fingers trembling as she placed it on his desk. "For the temple," she had whispered, her voice breaking. David would have wanted it this way. Now she stood, radiant, whispering prayers of gratitude to an anonymous benefactor who had saved them all. The young Abrams family sat in the third row, their 4-year-old daughter Rachel coloring quietly in a prayer book while her parents, Michael and Lisa, held hands for the first time in months without the tension of financial stress pulling them apart. They had delayed having a second child for 3 years, both working double shifts to contribute what they could to the temple's desperate fundraising efforts. Lisa had cleaned offices at night after her teaching job, while Michael delivered pizza on weekends. Now, as they planned Rachel's upcoming Hebrew school enrollment, their faces glowed with the possibility of the future they had put on hold. David Miller, the temple's longtime treasurer, sat in his usual seat near the front, his ledger books finally showing numbers that didn't make him lose sleep. For 2 decades, he had carried the burden of their debt like a physical weight, staying up nights calculating and recalculating, searching for ways to stretch every donated dollar. The foreclosure notice that had arrived just 4 months ago was now just a bad memory, replaced by a bank statement showing a zero balance that still felt like a miracle. The weight that had pressed on their community's shoulders for over 2 decades, the constant worry, the difficult choices between heating bills and Hebrew school, the painful conversations about selling the building their grandparents had helped construct, had vanished overnight. In its place was pure, unadulterated gratitude to whoever had swooped in like a guardian angel, asking for nothing in return except their continued faith and community. 3 days earlier, David Miller had burst into Rabbi Goldstein's cramped study, like a man who had seen the impossible. His usually composed demeanor had completely abandoned him, leaving behind trembling hands and disbelief written across every line of his 67-year-old face. The morning sun streamed through the rabbi's single window as David collapsed into the worn leather chair across from the desk, clutching a piece of paper like it contained divine revelation. "Samuel," he had gasped, using the rabbi's first name only in moments of extreme emotion. "I just got off the phone with First National Bank. Our mortgage, all of it, $340,000, it's been paid. Completely, in full." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if saying them slowly might make them disappear. "Wire transfer came in yesterday afternoon from some offshore account. No name, no message, just a reference number that leads absolutely nowhere when we try to trace it." Rabbi Goldstein had set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his mind racing through the implications. The congregation had spent the last 8 months in increasingly desperate fundraising mode. They had organized bake sales where elderly members donated their grocery money to buy ingredients. Families had sold wedding rings, inherited china, and children's college funds. The Weinstein family had mortgaged their home to loan the temple $15,000. Young couples had worked multiple jobs, and retirees had returned to work despite health problems. The previous Sunday, Rabbi Goldstein had looked out at his congregation and seen the exhaustion in their eyes. Good people who had given until it hurt, then given more. The foreclosure notice posted on the community bulletin board had felt like a death sentence, not just for their building, but for their entire spiritual community that had weathered every storm for nearly 6 decades. David, the rabbi, had said carefully, "Banks don't make mistakes about this kind of money. Someone, somewhere, decided to save us. But who has that kind of resources and knows about our situation?" They had sat in stunned silence, 2 men who had shepherded this community through every crisis, now facing the most bewildering blessing of their lives. By evening, the entire congregation knew of their miraculous salvation, and wild speculation filled every conversation. A wealthy, distant relative, a grateful former member, perhaps even a non-Jewish neighbor, moved by their public struggles. Rabbi Goldstein should have felt nothing but pure joy as he watched his congregation's celebration unfold around him, but something indefinable gnawed at the edges of his conscience like a persistent toothache. In his 30 years serving Temple Beth Shalom, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the undercurrents of human nature, to sense when something wasn't quite right, even when everything appeared perfect on the surface. Anonymous gifts of this magnitude were extraordinarily rare in his experience. Most major donors wanted recognition, tax receipts, or at minimum the satisfaction of seeing their generosity appreciated. The complete anonymity of this gift, the untraceable account, the lack of any message or condition, felt almost too convenient, too perfect for a community that had been drowning in debt for decades. As he moved through the celebrating crowd, accepting embraces and sharing in their relief, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered warnings that he couldn't quite silence. His rabbinical training at Hebrew Union College had included courses on ethics that explored how the greatest gifts sometimes carried the heaviest moral burdens. Professor Goldberg had been fond of saying, "When something seems too good to be true, a rabbi's job is to ask the hard questions, not to simply accept the blessing." He found himself studying the faces around him with new intensity, wondering if one of his congregants might be hiding the secret to their salvation. Could Mrs. Rosen have inherited more than she let on? Had the Kaufman's son, who worked in finance in New York, somehow engineered this rescue? But even as he considered these possibilities, they felt hollow. None of his congregants had the kind of wealth that would allow them to casually pay off a $340,000 debt without anyone noticing the financial impact. The celebration continued around him, children running between the pews, elderly members sharing stories of the temple's early days when the mortgage had first been signed, young families making plans for the future they could now afford to have. Yet Rabbi Goldstein couldn't shake the feeling that their joy was built on foundations that might not be as solid as they appeared. Something about their salvation felt wrong, and his instincts, honed by decades of pastoral care and human observation, were rarely mistaken about such things. The truth came to Rabbi Goldstein through the most unlikely and devastating source. A phone call from his nephew Marcus at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Marcus Goldstein was a federal prosecutor with the Southern District of New York, a serious man who rarely called unless someone in the family was getting married or buried. The late hour alone suggested something urgent and probably unpleasant. "Uncle Sam," Marcus's voice was tight with the kind of professional concern that made the rabbi's stomach drop. "I need to ask you something sensitive about your synagogue, and I need you to listen very carefully before you respond." The formal tone sent ice through Rabbi Goldstein's veins. This wasn't family Marcus calling. This was federal prosecutor Marcus, and that distinction had never been good news. "We've been conducting a major investigation into money laundering operations connected to Russian organized crime," Marcus continued, his words precise and measured. "For the past 18 months, we've been tracking enormous sums of money flowing through what appear to be charitable donations to religious institutions across the Northeast. The pattern is sophisticated, amounts just under federal reporting requirements, sent to organizations in financial distress, always from untraceable offshore accounts. Rabbi Goldstein's mouth went dry as Marcus continued with the methodical precision of someone delivering terrible news. 3 days ago, one of our monitored accounts transferred $340,000 to pay off a mortgage in your area. Uncle Sam, the account used to pay your temple's debt is directly linked to Viktor Petrov, a Russian money launderer we've been pursuing for 3 years. He's been using charitable donations to clean drug money, and your synagogue appears to be his latest unwitting accomplice. The phone felt impossibly heavy in Rabbi Goldstein's hand as the full implications crashed over him like a physical blow. The joyous faces of his congregation flashed through his mind, Mrs. Rosen's tears of gratitude, the Abrams family planning their daughter's Hebrew school education, David Miller's relief at finally closing the books on decades of financial struggle. All of it built on blood money from criminals who destroyed lives and communities just like theirs. "How certain are you?" he managed to whisper, though he already knew the answer from Marcus's tone. "Completely certain, Uncle Sam. I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." Rabbi Goldstein sat alone in his study until dawn, staring at the framed photographs that lined his walls like a museum of his life's work. Each image represented lives that would be shattered by the knowledge now burning in his chest. Bar mitzvahs where 13-year-olds had become adults in the eyes of their faith, weddings where young couples had pledged their futures under the chuppah, baby namings where families had welcomed new souls into their community covenant. His congregation had endured years of genuine suffering. The Kowalski family had mortgaged their small home to loan the temple $8,000, money they couldn't afford to lose but gave anyway because their faith meant more than their financial security. Elderly members like Harold Weinstein had chosen between prescription medications and temple donations, sometimes skipping pills so they could contribute to the building fund. Young families had delayed having children, moved to smaller apartments, and worked multiple jobs to keep their spiritual home alive. The memory of last month's emergency board meeting haunted him. David Miller presenting spreadsheets showing they had exactly 6 weeks before foreclosure, good people breaking down in tears as they calculated how much more they could possibly sacrifice. Sarah Rosen had offered to sell her deceased husband's prayer books, family heirlooms passed down through 4 generations, because she couldn't bear the thought of their temple closing. Now their relief and joy, so pure and so deserved after decades of struggle, were built on money that came from drug dealers who destroyed families and communities every single day. The ethical weight pressed down on him like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe. Every moment he stayed silent, he became more complicit in the crime. Every day his congregation celebrated their salvation, they unknowingly celebrated the profits from addiction, overdoses, and destroyed lives. The choice felt impossible. Keep silent and allow his people to finally prosper on tainted foundations, or speak the truth and watch the community he had sworn to protect and serve crumble under the weight of moral catastrophe. His rabbinical vows demanded truth and righteousness, but his pastoral heart couldn't bear the thought of destroying the very people who had trusted him to guide them through their darkest hours to this moment of light. Unable to bear the weight of his knowledge alone, Rabbi Goldstein drove through the empty pre-dawn streets to Sunset Manor, where Rabbi Emeritus Sarah Friedman lived in assisted care. At 92, she had served Temple Beth Shalom for 40 years before his arrival, guiding the community through the civil rights era, the Vietnam War, and countless personal tragedies and triumphs. If anyone could help him navigate this moral labyrinth, it would be the woman who had taught him that being a rabbi meant carrying burdens too heavy for any one person to bear alone. Despite the early hour, Rabbi Friedman welcomed him with knowing eyes that had witnessed decades of human moral complexity. Her tiny apartment was filled with books, commentaries on Jewish law, volumes of ethical philosophy, and worn copies of scripture that had guided her through similar crossroads many times before. She listened as he poured out his dilemma, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her expression growing more grave with each detail. "Samuel," she said when he finished, her voice still strong despite her frail body, "do you remember what we learned about the concept of pikuach nefesh, the saving of life that supersedes almost all other religious obligations?" He nodded, confused about where she was leading. "Our people have survived for thousands of years by holding fast to truth, even when it cost us everything we held dear. The money may solve our immediate problems, but what does it cost our souls? What does it cost the souls of those whose suffering financed our salvation?" She stood slowly and walked to her bookshelf, pulling out a volume of Talmudic commentary. "Here," she said, pointing to a passage about accepting stolen goods. "The sages teach us that we cannot build holiness on unholy foundations. A temple saved by blood money is no temple at all. It becomes a monument to our moral compromise." Rabbi Friedman took his hand with surprising strength. Sometimes being a rabbi means bearing the burden of unpopular truth. Sometimes it means watching people you love suffer, because the alternative, allowing them to prosper through others' pain, is a greater evil than their temporary hardship. The choice is terrible, Samuel, but it is also clear. The next morning brought additional devastating news from Marcus that made Rabbi Goldstein's moral crisis even more complex and urgent. The FBI investigation had uncovered the full scope of Viktor Petrov's operation, a sophisticated money laundering scheme that had been running for over 5 years, systematically targeting religious institutions across 7 states. "It's not just your synagogue, Uncle Sam," Marcus explained during their second phone call, his prosecutorial tone unable to mask his personal anguish. "We've identified 37 churches, mosques and temples that have received similar anonymous donations over the past 3 years. Always institutions in financial crisis, always amounts just under the federal reporting thresholds, always from accounts that trace back to Petrov's network. The scope was staggering. Petrov had turned religious faith into his personal money laundering service, exploiting the desperation of struggling communities and their gratitude for unexpected salvation. Each donation represented millions of dollars in drug profits being cleaned through the prayers and hopes of innocent people who believed their prayers had been answered by divine intervention. The money your temple received represents the profits from a heroin distribution network that operates from Boston to Baltimore," Marcus continued, his voice heavy with the weight of evidence he had been compiling. "In the past year alone, we've connected this network to 43 overdose deaths, including 2 teenagers. The investigation has documented how families have been destroyed, how entire neighborhoods have been consumed by addiction, how parents have buried children, all so that Petrov could generate the profits he's been washing through donations to places like your synagogue." Rabbi Goldstein closed his eyes, seeing the faces of his celebrating congregation superimposed over the faceless victims of the drug trade that had funded their salvation. Every dollar that had paid their mortgage had come from someone's destroyed life, someone's lost child, someone's family torn apart by addiction and despair. "There's more," Marcus said quietly. "The operation is ongoing. Every day we delay taking action, more money gets laundered, more communities get unknowingly involved, and more people die from the drugs that generate these profits. If religious institutions keep unknowingly providing cover for this operation, Petrov's network can continue operating indefinitely." The moral weight had just become exponentially heavier. This wasn't just about his congregation's compromised salvation, but about their unwitting role in perpetuating ongoing violence and death. Saturday morning services felt surreal as Rabbi Goldstein looked out at his congregation, seeing them with the terrible clarity that his new knowledge provided. Mrs. Rosen sat in her usual seat in the second row, but today she had brought her rarely attending grandson Daniel, a college sophomore who had driven down from Boston specifically to share in the joy of their financial miracle. She had called it witnessing God's provision for his faithful people when she invited him, her voice filled with the kind of joy Rabbi Goldstein hadn't heard from her since her husband's death 3 years ago. The Abrams family occupied their regular spot near the front, 4-year-old Rachel sitting quietly with her coloring books, while her parents, Michael and Lisa, followed along in the prayer book with an attention and enthusiasm they hadn't shown in months. After the service, they approached him with plans for Rachel's Hebrew school education, their faces glowing with the possibility of giving their daughter the Jewish education they had thought they could no longer afford. Lisa was already pregnant with their second child, a pregnancy they had planned the week after learning about the mortgage payment. David Miller sat in his customary seat, but his entire posture had changed. For the first time in Rabbi Goldstein's memory, David wasn't hunched over financial calculations during services. His ledger books remained closed, his calculator stayed in his pocket, and his face showed the peaceful expression of a man who could finally sleep through the night without worrying about foreclosure notices and impossible numbers. The trust in their eyes was absolute and heartbreaking. They looked at Rabbi Goldstein as their spiritual shepherd, who had somehow guided them through their darkest financial crisis to this moment of triumph. They had no idea that their leader was contemplating destroying their joy with a truth that would shatter not just their current happiness, but their faith in divine providence and their belief that good things could still happen to good people who had suffered long enough. During his sermon about gratitude and divine providence, Rabbi Goldstein felt like a fraud, speaking words about God's goodness while knowing that their blessing had come from the profits of human misery. Each word felt like ashes in his mouth, each smile from his congregants like a knife in his heart. That afternoon, Rabbi Goldstein walked through Temple Beth Shalom's empty halls like a man saying goodbye. He touched the prayer books that had been donated by families who could barely afford groceries, ran his fingers along the walls that represented 60 years of community devotion and sacrifice, and stood in the sanctuary where 3 generations had celebrated life's holiest moments. In his office, he opened his desk drawer and looked at 2 documents he had prepared during his sleepless night. His resignation letter, written in case he chose silence and could no longer live with the weight of his knowledge, and his sermon notes for tomorrow's community celebration, where he planned to reveal the truth that would destroy everything his congregants had worked so hard to preserve. The resignation letter was brief. "I can no longer serve as your spiritual leader due to circumstances that compromise my ability to guide you with integrity and honesty. Please know that this decision reflects my failings, not yours, and that you deserve a rabbi who can stand before you without carrying secrets that would break your hearts." But the sermon notes were more detailed, outlining how he would explain the source of their mortgage payment, the ongoing criminal investigation, and the moral obligation they now faced to return money that had been earned through human suffering. He had written and rewritten the words, trying to find a way to deliver devastating news with compassion, knowing that no amount of gentle phrasing could soften the blow. Both paths led to the destruction of something precious. Silence would destroy his integrity and make him complicit in ongoing crime, but it would preserve his community's joy and financial stability. Truth would preserve his moral standing, but would almost certainly destroy the community he had devoted his life to serving. Some families would leave in anger, others in shame, The financial stress would return, possibly worse than before, because now they would face not just poverty, but the knowledge that their previous salvation had been tainted. The choice felt like being asked to choose between his soul and his heart, between his calling as a moral leader and his love for the people who had trusted him with their spiritual care. Either way, he would lose something essential to who he was, as both a rabbi and a human being. Sunday evening's community celebration was in full swing when Rabbi Goldstein made the choice that would define the rest of his rabbinical career. The temple's social hall had been decorated with balloons and streamers. Families had brought potluck dishes to share, and children ran between tables while adults shared stories and dreams for their newly secure future. David Miller stood at the front of the room, raising a glass of ceremonial wine to toast their anonymous benefactor and the bright future that stretched ahead of them. "To whoever you are," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "you have saved not just our building, but our entire community. May God bless you as you have blessed us." The applause was thunderous, filled with genuine gratitude and joy. Mrs. Rosen wiped away tears. The Abrams family lifted their glasses high, and even the children seemed to sense the momentous nature of the occasion. It was then that Rabbi Goldstein approached the microphone with steps that felt like walking to his own execution. "Please, everyone," he said, his voice cutting through the laughter and conversation like a knife through silk. "I need your attention. There is something you must know before our celebration continues." The room gradually quieted, faces turning toward him with expectant smiles that he knew would soon vanish forever, replaced by expressions of shock, betrayal, and devastation that would haunt his dreams for years to come. With a deep breath that felt like diving into icy water, he began, "I have learned the source of our mortgage payment, and I cannot in good conscience allow our celebration to continue without sharing this knowledge with all of you." The words that followed, drug money, money laundering, blood on their hands, federal investigation, moral obligation, fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through every corner of their tight-knit community. David Miller's wine glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor in the sudden silence. Mrs. Rosen's face went pale, her grandson reaching out to steady her as she swayed. The Abrams family stared in disbelief, Lisa's hand moving instinctively to her pregnant belly as if to protect her unborn child from this new reality. Some members began crying, others stood in stunned silence, and a few started shouting questions that had no good answers. The celebration had become a funeral for their innocence, and Rabbi Goldstein was both the mourner and the one who had delivered the fatal blow. The room erupted in chaos that would echo through the temple for months to come. Some members stormed out in fury, their anger directed not at the criminals who had used them, but at the rabbi who had shattered their joy with unwanted truth. Others wept openly, mourning not just their lost financial security, but their lost faith in the possibility of uncomplicated blessings. A few, too few, approached Rabbi Goldstein with gratitude for his honesty, understanding that he had sacrificed his own peace of mind to preserve their moral integrity. David Miller sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour after most people had left, staring at the shattered wine glass at his feet as if it represented all of their broken dreams. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. 23 years of struggle, and it turns out our salvation was a lie. How do we come back from this, Samuel? How do we tell our grandchildren that we celebrated blood money? Mrs. Rosen, supported by her grandson, approached the rabbi with tears streaming down her weathered face. "You did the right thing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My David would have been ashamed if we had kept that money knowing where it came from. We'll find another way, just like we always have." In the weeks that followed, the community faced the agonizing decision of what to do with their terrible knowledge. The FBI investigation meant they couldn't simply return the money. It was evidence in an ongoing criminal case. Some families left the congregation forever, unable to reconcile their faith with this moral complexity. Others stayed and began the painful work of rebuilding their synagogue on honest foundations, even though it meant returning to the financial struggles they had briefly escaped. Rabbi Goldstein kept his position, but everything had changed. His sermons took on a different quality, speaking more often about moral courage and the price of integrity. The community was smaller, poorer, and sadder, but it was also more authentic. They had learned that true salvation couldn't be built on others' suffering, and that sometimes the most loving thing a leader can do is tell the truth that breaks everyone's heart. The mortgage remained unpaid, the building remained at risk, but their souls remained intact, and in the end, Rabbi Goldstein knew that was the only foundation upon which a genuine spiritual community could be built. Thank you for listening to this story of moral courage and impossible choices. It reminds us that integrity sometimes demands we sacrifice our comfort for our principles, and that true leadership means being willing to bear the burden of difficult truths. Please share in the comments where you're listening from around the world, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that explore the complexities of human nature and the price of doing what's right, even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted.